Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to give you guys a tutorial for beginners inside of GIMP. So the idea here is that we're going to be covering a bunch of the basic functions that you would come across trying to edit photos or graphics inside of GIMP. What you see here on this little sticky note, that's what I'm going to be trying to cover going down the list in order. May come across some other things that we just kind of throw in there if it makes sense. And we'll try to keep it to a reasonable time. So by the end of this tutorial, hopefully you guys have a pretty good idea about how to use GIMP for editing photos or graphics, at least at a basic level. So before we get started, I think it would be a decent idea to mention changing the theme of GIMP. So if you boot up GIMP and you don't like the default look of the interface, you can actually change your theme to a dark, a gray, or a light theme by going up to the edit menu at the top left and going down to preferences. And then you can go down to theme and you'll see dark, gray, light, and system themes as options here. It's also possible to find additional themes on the internet. Generally, I just like to stick with the dark theme. I find it to be easier on the eye. So putting that aside, when you launch GIMP for the first time, you're going to be met with a bunch of windows scattered around the screen. In the top left, you have the toolbox window, which will feature most of the tools that you use to work on your project inside of GIMP. So if you're looking for something like a paintbrush, a fill bucket, the ability to scale or move around anything inside of your graphic, then you're probably going to find that in the top left. In the middle section, obviously, you have the display for the image you're currently working on. You might notice that there are two tabs up here at the top left. So it's possible to actually have multiple images loaded up into GIMP. And if you don't already know, to load up an image, you can just go to File and then Open, locate it on your computer. Or if you have it open in Windows File Explorer, or the operating system that you happen to be using, you can just drag it into the program, and that should also load it into this middle section. So whenever you want to directly edit something in your image, you're probably going to be doing that in this middle section here. If you want to kind of pan the location for where this image is going to display, you can hold middle mouse button down and move it around. So I'm going to do that right there so that this sticky note isn't in the way of what we're editing. You can actually see that there's 5 tabs here by default. So this is a history of documents you've been working on. The ability to change fonts here. So when you start working on a text element, you can switch fonts by double clicking on them here. Patterns which you can use for filling in spaces, such as a rectangular select selection, which you can left click, hold, and drag to create a box with when you have that selected. So that's one of the most basic tools over there. So just left click, hold, and drag, and that's how you get a rectangular shape selection. So let's go over here to brushes now. So all of these brushes are also going to be seen when you're working in paintbrush mode. So in the top left, you can see the toolbox. The icon for paintbrush is right here, paintbrush tool. You can see the hotkey to change to that tool by clicking a button on your keyboard. In this case, P switches to paintbrush mode without having to use the toolbox. You can see also in this group, N for pencil, A for airbrush, K for ink, and Y for my paint. So I'll mention the difference between pencil and paintbrush really quickly here. So before we get into the difference between paintbrush and pencil, all of these brushes you can also access by clicking on this icon here, and you'll see all the same icons. So when you want to draw with a different shape, you can come in here and switch to a different brush, and then start using that instead of the default 75 hardness circular brush. And actually worth mentioning, most of the functions that you find in these top 5 windows, you can actually just get in the toolbox when you have the right tool selected. So you don't actually need to go to fonts when you want to change the font, as long as you're using the title tool. So I don't frequently actually use the windows in the top right. So next, the difference between the paintbrush tool and the pencil tool essentially comes down to the pencil tool not having any blurring around the edges. So if I use the paintbrush tool here, and I'm intentionally clicking outside of that rectangular select we created here, so I'm left click, holding down, and then moving my mouse or drawing tablet around to create the stroke, and then the paintbrush goes in that pattern. Now there's 2 things you should note here real quick. First off, because we selected that area with the rectangular select tool, the only areas which actually got drawn in were the areas that that rectangular select was in. So in GIMP, you can never paint outside of your current selection. So if you ever have a problem where you're trying to draw somewhere and you don't actually see anything appear, you might have a selection already made. So one way you can get that gone is to go back to the rectangular select tool, which can be R on the keyboard, and then just left click without holding, and then that should get rid of the selection. So now I'm able to draw basically any way I want. Okay, the other thing, and I'm holding Control and middle mouse wheel to zoom in. So I'm scrolling on that middle mouse wheel, and we go in really far. You can see that there's a bit of blurriness on the edge of this paintbrush. So when we get close to the edge of where we were drawing, there is decreasing levels of transparency until it basically hits 0% transparency. So this creates kind of an anti-aliasing effect where if we zoom out, it looks like it blurs together a little bit more and you don't see any hard edges. So you'll get a smoother look if you're using paintbrush instead of pencil. To demonstrate that, let's switch back to pencil. So pencil, I'm just going to draw it over here. You can see it completely ignores the hardness of the brush. So there is no blurriness whatsoever as we get to the edges, but it's very pixelated, which in some cases might be good. If you happen to be working on pixel art, you'd probably want to use the pencil tool, not the brush tool. Now, speaking of the hardness of a brush, you can see back in paintbrush mode, there's actually a slider for this. So even if a brush says 75 hardness, you can decrease that manually, and then that just changes the presets on that brush. And then this will give you a different result than the defaults for the brush. You can also click on the brushes, and there are 4 levels of hardness set by default. So 100% is over here. You might notice that this looks kind of similar to the pencil tool, except not entirely. There's still a little bit of this edge blurring. It's not really true 100% across the board with just having plain black pixels, but rather you can see if you zoom in that there's just this like 1 pixel blurred edge. But if we switch down to 25% hardness, then it's going to be very obvious, this blurriness. So whatever level you need it set at, you can customize that setting, as well as many other settings that we're going to kind of gloss over here for the sake of time. So next up, I wanted to talk about the bucket fill tool and the gradient tool. So in order to demonstrate this, let me go ahead and use the rectangular select tool. So you can hit R on your keyboard if you haven't already. And I'm going to left click, hold, and drag a box. So with this selection, we can fill that with the paint bucket tool. So to get to the paint bucket tool, I'm going to click over here. Shift B is the hotkey. And I can just left click inside our selection to fill it completely. Okay, so now we've actually run into a minor issue, which is that the bucket fill is filling based on the color that I clicked on. So if I hit Control Z and I left click again, you'll notice that wherever I click on, it's the similar colors that are filled, not everything inside of the box. It's easy to make it actually fill everything in the box, and I'll show you that in a second. But if you're ever wondering why when you click, it doesn't fill in all the color, or it fills too much color for any tool, you can look at a threshold setting. So if I set the threshold to 0, that's going to mean that it will only accept exactly that color for the click. And you'll notice that because we're dealing with the sky, the color of the blue does vary a little bit. So it doesn't go very far at all. And if we bump the threshold up to something much higher, then it may just actually fill everything inside of that. So a threshold of 140 is obviously very high. But if you want to make sure that it just fills the box completely, you may actually want to work on another layer. So we were going to touch on this in a bit, but hey, why not mention it now? It's relevant. Layers are super useful in GIMP and any other photo editing program. So it's something you're definitely going to want to know. So in the bottom right hand section, we have the layers panel, as well as channel and paths, but layers is definitely the most important. So for now, if you want to create a new layer, you can click on this icon down here. So I'm going to do that. And in this new layer dialog box, we'll call it top layer. And you'll notice that it sits above the image layer. So now in this top layer, there's no colors for it to interact with the threshold. So even if we set the threshold to 0, if I click inside the box, it's going to fill everything. So if I hit Control Z, I can show you what actually happened there a little better. If I hide the image layer, that's the image we actually brought in to start editing. So I'm going to hide it with this little eyeball icon. And now you can see the only thing left showing is the top layer. You'll notice this checker pattern whenever something is partially or completely transparent, meaning that there's actually no color information for the pixels where this background is showing on any of the visible layers. And because there's no color, the fill bucket is actually just free to fill everything inside of these bounds. So if I left click on that, we get a perfect fill regardless of the threshold setting. So for that reason, oftentimes, if you just want to have something sit above the underlying image, and instead of trying to edit things directly onto the underlying image, you can separate stuff into separate layers, and it helps for many different reasons. One is that it makes it non-destructive. in the sense that if you want to completely remove all of the changes you did to one layer, then you can just delete that layer or go into that layer and edit part of it out. So I can just select with the rectangular select box here, and I can hit Control X with the top layer selected. And what happens is it only actually modifies that layer which I'm currently active on. But earlier on, we didn't have a separate layer. So when we drew with the paintbrush strokes here, these are basically permanent at this point. And unless we were going to undo a bunch of the changes by either going up to the edit menu and hitting undo, or just pressing Control Z until enough changes were undone that this change hadn't been made yet. But if for some reason you run into a change where you're unable to edit it anymore, like this, you can draw a box around it, hit Control X, but you'll see that also cuts out the background. So it just becomes much more of a pain when you try to do everything on one layer. It's a bad practice. So try to get in the habit of creating different layers for different parts of the image you're working on, as long as it's still within GIMP. So next, back to the difference between paint bucket and gradients. And one other thing I want to point out is that in the modern version of GIMP, a lot of the icons up here are actually turned into drop downs. So if you were used to old versions of GIMP, you might have seen a lot more icons here, but they've just been nested down in grouped categories. So if you right click on one of these icons that has the little drop down arrow here, you can see all of the other related tools inside of that drop down. So for instance, you don't find the gradient tool up here, you find the paint bucket tool, and then you right click and switch to gradient. Once you get used to where everything's at, it's a little bit cleaner, it makes sense. So let's switch to the gradient tool here. The difference between gradient and fill is that, well, one, gradient can fill with patterns, and secondly, with a gradient, you're usually transitioning from one or multiple colors into other colors as the gradient progresses. So I'm going to click on the top layer so that we can undo these changes later. I'm going to use the rectangular select tool. Oh, actually, no, let's use the ellipse select tool. So I'm going to right click and we'll go down to ellipse select. Difference here is that it is an oval shape instead of a rectangle shape. And now I'm going to left click and drag it out to get a selection on this patch of ground. By the way, you'll notice that once you've made a selection, you can actually change it with these controls on the top and corner of the oval shape. So you can customize this until you get exactly the right shape. And now we need to set up the gradient. So gradient tool, we can click on this button here, similar to selecting a brush, and change to one of the gradients that are set here by default. So you notice that the first 5 or so say foreground to background, or FG to BG, standing for foreground to background. And that is referring to your foreground and background colors. So that's set up here. So the easiest way to get a 2-color gradient that has exactly the 2 colors you want is actually to customize them up here. So I'm just gonna select a color, and what I'll do is I'll hit X, and then I'll click on the background color here, and we'll change it to something else. Let's say something like a light blue. And now if I click on the gradient drop down, you'll see that these foreground to background color options have changed. So if I want a hard edge gradient, as in there's no blurriness between the first color and the last color, then I can choose that. Or we can go down here to FG to BG RGB, which would be the standard one where you want it to actually fade a bit between the 2 colors, so it'll transition. So let's select that. So let's select that. And now I have the gradient tool ready to go. So what I need to do is left click where I want the starting point for a color to be, hold it down, drag it out in the direction that you want the gradient to fade. So you'll see that because I'm going left to right, the fade line also goes left to right. And then when you position the end point to where you want it to be, where you think the gradient looks good, you can let go. You'll have the preview for the gradient made. You can still left click on these points and change them before you make your final edit. You can also left click on the points if you want to change the color. So if we decide, hey, maybe we want a darker color gradient, we can select that and hit OK. And then when we're ready to commit the gradient, we can hit enter on the keyboard, and now we have a gradient, and it's drawn within the shape of whatever we had selected. So if you wanted it to just gradient everything on the layer across the entire screen, you would just have nothing selected, and then you can do the gradient. So that could give you a very simple looking background, for instance. I'm going to hit Control Z to remove that. And let's actually select this stuff from the top layer and go ahead and delete it. So I'm going to use the rectangular select tool, draw a box, and I'm going to Control X to cut it away. Now, technically, when you use cut like that with Control X, it's still in the buffer. So if you ever wanted to paste it in somewhere else, you can hit Control V, and then you can move it around by left clicking inside of the area, and you can just put it wherever you want it to be. So if you wanted to move something from one side to the other, that's one way you could do it pretty easily. But let's actually select that, hit Control X, and forget about it. We don't need it anymore. So let's talk about a couple other useful hotkeys. So I'm going to go back to the Paintbrush tool to demonstrate this. We already changed our foreground and background color. So whatever is your foreground color is the one that you're going to be drawing with, let's say, the paintbrush. So if I left click and I drag this around the screen, you'll see that it uses this red color. So the easy way to switch to this other color, currently the background color, is to hit X on the keyboard. So when I hit X, you'll see that the blue and the red swapped places. And now I can draw with the blue line. I can hit X, draw with the red line, and X, draw with the blue line. So you can see, if you want to go back and forth between two colors, it's a very fast and easy way to do it. The manual way of switching the color is to go over here to this little icon that has arrows going in both directions. You can click that, but honestly, if you can learn the hotkeys, it's just going to make things a lot faster. Another super useful hotkey is Control I, which inverts your selection. So let's say we were using the rectangular select tool and we wanted to put a box around this person, right? So we roughly have the person selected, but what we actually wanted to do was to cut away the background. So rather than drawing separate boxes, like one from the top left to here and cutting it away, one from the right side to the bottom and cutting that, and then the bottom left to the bottom right and cutting that, basically creating 4 boxes. What we can just do is invert this selection. So if I hit Control I on the keyboard, now we have everything outside of this person's space selected, and I can just hit the delete key. First, we actually have to be on the right layer. So click on the suitcase layer in this case, or whatever your image is called, and then hit delete. So basically, whenever you do a change, it affects the layer you currently have selected, obviously. Okay, now in this case, the background turned red. So that's because our active background is set to red. And because this was imported as a .jpg or .jpeg image, it does not have an alpha channel, so the background can't be transparent. If you ever run into that situation where you do want to completely remove the background, what you can do is right-click on the image, go down to Add Alpha Channel, add that in there, and now with this same selection, I can hit delete again, and the background color will be completely removed. It has an alpha channel, so the background can be transparent. And at this point, you could bring in, let's say, another image or add a new layer. So I'll just create a new layer here, put this down below the suitcase layer so that it's on bottom. Whatever's on top shows on top, whatever's on bottom shows on bottom, of course. So let's use the gradient tool here, and I'll just make a really quick gradient. And just like that, I created a background that is on a separate layer from the suitcase layer. So pretty handy, and what's even better is that because we're using separate layers, if we decide, hey, we don't like this gradient, well, we can just delete the layer for the gradient altogether and have it not affect the original image. So once again, layers are a great thing. Okay, I'm gonna hit Control Z a few times, and we'll go back to before we deleted the character here. So next is layer masks. So a mask is basically when you want to hide part of your layer from being visible or used in certain ways. So the basic way of using the mask is you want to hide part of the background without actually removing it. It's just that the mask doesn't allow it to show through. So to add a layer mask to a layer, we right-click the layer and choose Add Layer Mask. And we're going to initialize this with full opacity. So you can see the color white means it's visible, full opacity, and the color black means it's fully transparent. So you don't actually draw colors on a layer mask, but you draw different shades of white or black. So I'm going to initialize it with full opacity, and because everything in the layer mask is white, that means everything on the layer mask is going to be visible. So now if I change to the brush tool, so you could draw with the color on the layer mask, and in that case, in a sense, it's going to be looking at the brightness of that color. So a color that's closer to black will hide more if you draw on the layer mask with it. and a color that's closer to white is going to allow more of the original image to show through. But because that just overcomplicates things, I would definitely use a shade of white or black, just so you know exactly what you're getting and you don't have that color kind of getting in the way of things. So if you want something to be more transparent, then make it closer to black over here. And if you want something on your layer mask to be more visible, then bring it up here to white in the top left hand corner. So I will draw with black for right now. So we're just going to use 100% black, HTML notation 00000. So now if we take this paintbrush, and we can also set the hardness, that is relevant since the edging will always have that blur. We can draw on our image to hide stuff. So I'll just take this brush and stroke it across the image. And we can kind of go crazy with this as long as we want to be hiding stuff. So you see, as we add black to the layer mask, more of the image hides. And it's not actually removing it from the image. If I right click and I, let's say, disable the layer mask, then you can see the image is still there. So this is another way to edit non-destructively, which is handy. Right, so if I wanted to show it again, I can switch to a white color. So changing this to the background color, hitting X to make the background color active color. So we can switch between black and white using X once again, like earlier. And now I'm going to use the paintbrush to show more of the mask again. So if I just stroke back over this, then we can take the mask and make it visible again. So pretty handy there. So next would be a decent chance to talk about the paths or the pen tool, depending on which program you're used to. So paths tool is over here. It's B. I think they use the key B because it's referring to Bezier curves, as in you can add handles to each of the points to curve the shape rather than having straight lines. I'll show you what I mean there in a minute. And what we can do with the paths tool is to draw a shape and have more control over it. So it won't just be a simple rectangle or a simple circle or ellipse, but it's actually more of a custom shape that we set many points on. And what we can use this for is actually cut the girl out of the original photo. And one reason we might do that is we want to combine her inside of another photo. Maybe not the most realistic thing initially, but it's a pretty simple photo operation. So let's go ahead and use the paths tool. So path tool, stay in design mode over here. I'm gonna zoom in, control middle mouse wheel, and you can left click to add a point. So this will be one of the points for our shape, and you can left click to add another point. So by default, it's a straight line. And you can keep left clicking to basically draw a shape around. And it's one way that you can separate a character from everything else in the graphic. You can see that these are all straight lines, but there may be cases where you'd want to actually add a curve shape to it. So this is where the Bezier curve thing comes into place. So when you left click to add your point, actually hold it down. And if you drag it away, there will be these handles that pop out. And depending on the position of these handles, they will control the shape of the curve. So rather than having a straight line between 2 points, you can get something more of a curve that might make more sense with the head, because heads aren't squares. They're much more circular or oval shape. And once you add the point, you can actually adjust these handles individually. So you'll see the left handle affects the shape of the curve on the left side, and the right handle adjust the shape of the curve on the right side. You can also left click on existing points. If you hold control down and you left click on it, you'll basically add the curve handles to it. So this one coming out on this side, and then I'll click on it again and we'll add the extra handle coming out of the right hand side. Now when we want to continue editing our shape, I'm gonna left click on the end point here. And then we'll left click, and you might notice the little plus sign there indicating we're adding a new point. And I'll continue adding the next point. And you'll see that even if we, I'll hit Control Z to undo that. If I just left click here, you'll see that there's a curve, even though I'm not setting any curves on the right endpoint, because there's still the curves from this left point that is actually controlling the shape of the right hand side. So the curves on one point can affect both sides of the path tool. And we can continue making it straight by not having any curves. And we can continue just with simple straight operations by left clicking after this, making sure that none of these points have any additional handles if we just want to keep it as simple and straight. And, you know, in general, I just find it a little bit quicker to work with the straight lines, but whatever you want to do. Depends on how precise you want to be. And we'll just keep outlining the shape of the person as we go down here. So let's keep going until we basically have it done. Okay, so we've almost outlined the entire shape here. To finish the last point, we actually need to hold Control down and then left click on the starting point. So you'll see this little linking icon here. Once you connect them, then you have a full path that outlines your object. Now this path is going to stay around even if you click out of it. It's going to stay in this paths window over here on the right next to layers. So anytime you want to select this selection, you can right click on unnamed over here and do path to selection. You also notice fill path, which is the equivalent of using the paint bucket tool on this, is also there, and stroke path is also an option. And so you can do a paintbrush stroke automatically all the way around the outline of this person by using stroke path. Likewise, if you right click with a path selected, then you can go into the edit menu, fill path and stroke path, so it's also available there. Anyway, what we want to do is select this path. So I'm just going to right click on the path, do path to selection, and now we have a selection of just this person. And if we want to, at this point, we could either, next we want to make sure that depending on if you're trying to actually remove it from the layer or if you're just trying to hide it in the mask, you can left click on the actual image data, or you can left click on the mask data, and then you can hit Control X to cut it away. So you see that when you use cut on the mask, it will leave a black silhouette in the mask, which effectively hides it. Up to you which way you want to do that. If we wanted to move the person to another document, we'd actually need to select the image data layer and hit Control X. And then we can left click on our other image and hit Control V and paste it in. And you'll see that by using the path tool, you actually get pretty decent results as long as you spent a little time to go around the outline. Another option back on the original image, I'm going to hit Control Z, would be to hit Control I once you have the person selected. So we're inverting the selection, meaning everything that's not the person is selected now, and then hit delete on the keyboard, removing it from the graphic. Though currently it looks like there's still no alpha channel. Maybe I undid one too many. So I'm going to right click and do add alpha channel, and then I'm going to hit delete again, and it's gone from the actual image. But yeah, once again, if we want to do that non-destructively, then we can just have that same selection, go to the mask layer, hit delete, and we effectively end up with the same result, except we can hide the masking layer and go back to actually having the image data still. So I guess masking layers would be superior in most cases. The less destructive you are to your image, the easier it will be to go back and fix any mistakes that you may have made. So now we could add in a background as an additional layer. So because our image is completely transparent minus the girl, we can just load up any image here. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and let's load in this Dark Hedges file. It actually loaded into a new image. So in that case, you can left click on the window, hit Control A to select everything. Note the dashed white line. Hit Control X to cut it away. Go back over to the other document. I'm going to add a new layer, and then I'm just going to hit Control V to paste it in. So that's one way you can, take another image and just drop it into whatever you're working on currently. We never really talked about the scale or rotate tools, so now would be a decent time. So you can find scale up here in the toolbox, Shift S on the keyboard as well. So scale is going to change the size of your current layer and increase or decrease it. So you may see this kind of stop sign looking thing. So depending on what mode your transform is in, if you hover over it with the scale tool, you may see this stop sign or cancel sign looking thing next to your cursor, meaning you can't actually scale it. So in this case, it's because there's no selection. But if you want to scale the layer, we can just go over here, select layer mode, left click on it, and we can scale in whichever directions we want. When you're scaling, it's really important to maintain aspect ratio. So you'll see here that there is a link between the width and the height. Generally speaking, you want that to be set there so that when you increase the width, the height also increases and it doesn't look distorted. So I'm going to click on the corners over here to make sure that I am scaling with both of those equally. So I'm going to left click on one of these square boxes in order to increase or decrease the size. And you'll notice that by default, it does keep that lock there. So if you didn't want the scaling to be locked, you could uncheck that, and now you can stretch the image in ways which probably isn't going to make it look good, but I mean, if you really need something to be taller for some reason, that would be how you do it. You can also hold shift down, which inverts the current locking selection. So if you're locked and you want it to be unlocked, just hold shift down while you edit, and then you can scale it without the lock constraints. So I'm going to Control Z a couple times. I want to make sure that locking is there if we're going to be adding this image to the background. By the way, in this case, the image is actually not tall enough to match the original image. So I can either crop the background, or if I do need the final image result to be as big as the canvas size, which is everything you see in this window, transparent space included, then you might want to work with bigger base images in terms of their width and height. So if you go to a stock image site or you take your own photos, working with higher resolutions would allow you to basically fit the size of whatever document you're trying to work in without resorting to stretching. And that would be ideal. Obviously, bigger photos have higher image sizes, so not always possible. But in this case, we'll just scale it to about here. I'll hit scale. So, and we could use the move tool to actually recenter it, but a better way might be to use this around center checkbox. So if we check around center, I'm going to hit Control Z, and then we scale it. It's actually going to scale from the center outward. So that is handy there. And you can see you can also toggle that on and off with Control. So if I hit Control, then it's going to invert the selection, just like keeping the aspect ratio or shift. So we could scale it just enough so that we need here to fit the height of the image. But in this case, I'm actually not going to use scale at all in the end. But just demonstrating the tool there. What we'll do instead is we'll crop away the canvas to match the image size. So just demonstrating another thing here. I'm going to left click, make sure nothing's selected here. We'll go up to image and find crop to content. So what crop to content is going to do is it's going to look at all of your layers, and it's going to reduce the image size to match basically what it needs. So crop to content, and then the new document size matches the size of whatever was displaying on the screen. Now, if we disabled the mask for that suitcase layer, you'll notice that the top and bottom actually did have information. But if it's not showing, it doesn't matter for the crop to content. Only what shows actually is relevant. So image crop to content is a really nice and easy way to refit the image for the final document. Okay, hopefully you guys are keeping up so far. So one last minor thing I want to point out about the cropping away of a person from the background. You'll see right here, there's this little gap area, and probably a few more actually, where I was unable to really use the pen tool effectively. So we could go into the suitcase layers and remove those. We could either use the E for the, or Shift E actually, for the eraser tool. Lower the size here down to something like 5. Zoom in with Control middle mouse wheel, and we can kind of manually get rid of this area. And then we can go to the masking layer here and erase this area, and then you'll see the new background will fade in for here. So that is one decent way you can do it, but you do have to be kind of careful with the pixels. You don't want to remove anything that you don't actually need. Actually, you could also just use the paintbrush and black color, and let's make sure that we're actually using a circle here. So size goes down to, let's say, 4. Okay, yeah, when you get to low pixel sizes, the shape is going to look a lot more boxy no matter what you do. So just be careful about that. 5 pixels is a box, and then 4 is kind of a cross. So you probably want to use more like 4 or 6 if you're looking at something this low. So that's one decent way you can kind of clean up those edges. One other way you can kind of clean up those areas is to go up to the select by color or fuzzy select tools. So fuzzy select is going to select a color and try to find pixels around it that are the similar color. And then select by color is going to, and I think the difference is that with select by color, it actually might expand to other areas that aren't directly connected. So that's what it's referring to with fuzzy select by contiguous, as in each of the pixels that are selected are directly adjacent to each other. So for this case, we'd probably want fuzzy select tool, and we want to do this clicking on the image layer, not the mask layer for suitcase. So I can just go in here, set a threshold to increase the types of colors which are allowed to be matched with the color selected, and then you left click and you should get a decent shape of those areas that have this similar color, that are contiguous. And now I can hit delete on the keyboard and remove them. And now with that selected, and now I can go over to the mask layer here, and I could hit delete. I believe when you do hit the delete though, it uses whatever your background color is, so I'm going to swap that to black here. And now let's try hitting delete here. Yes, okay. And so those pixels have been replaced with black for the mask layer, which means that they are invisible, which is what we want. So we can do it that way. Obviously you can see though, it's a little bit crude, so you may still want to clean up with a brush or eraser tool after that. I guess the eraser tool is more appropriate here. Just make sure your pixel size is good for what you're trying to accomplish. I'm gonna unselect everything, and we'll just come in here with the eraser tool. So now to quickly show one other thing that a lot of people like to do, especially for things like thumbnails. You might not be happy with the results around the edges of your cutout. So like if you look up here, especially with hair and that kind of thing, you can see reasonably well that it doesn't exactly belong to the original shot. It looks like there's something missing a little bit, right? So what some people like to do to get around that is to stroke the outside of the path of the cutout. So you could either kind of make it blurry with like a paintbrush and a low hardness setting, and then going around the edge of it. So using black color, and then around the edges, of course you'd use a much smaller size. So this is like one manual way you could kind of do it, and just make it look a little bit more blurry on the outside. Another way that's easier is you could just stroke it with a white color. So I'm switching my color back to white. We'll go to the path. I'm going to right click on the path. I'm going to stroke the path, and we're going to use whatever line width, however thick we want it to be in terms of pixels. I'll just go for 6. I'll hit stroke. Okay, wait. So on layers, make sure that you're actually selecting the image data and not the layer mask, or else it's going to affect what gets shown and hidden, not the actual color. So let's go back to the paths window once again. Right click it, stroke path, and let's stroke it. So now we have a white border that goes all the way around the person, and effectively what we've done is kind of turned her into a sticker. Some people like to do this for YouTube thumbnails, that sort of thing. So if you're ever interested in that kind of thing, that is one way you can do it. I'll hit Control Z for now. And so at this point, we're getting pretty close to the end, but a few other slightly more advanced things we can touch on. Color tools. So color tools, we can go up to the color menu here, and let's talk about a couple here. So for instance, saturation. So when you want colors to be either very vivid or non-existent, basically black and white, you can change the color on a layer. So if I have my layer here selected and I go to saturation, we can increase or decrease the scale of the saturation to make the color more or less vivid. So if I go down on the saturation towards 0, person becomes black and white. And once again, this re-emphasizes how useful layers are, because we're applying the saturation to a single layer, so we're not destructively changing everything in the document, only what we're currently working on in that one layer. And in reverse, we can of course saturate the character, which we might actually want to do here, because this is a very, very vivid background scene. So we kind of want any imported people to kind of reflect that. So let's increase the saturation to something like 1.134, and we can go ahead and hit OK on that. All right, so another option, hot to cold. So inside of colors, we'd be looking at color temperature here. So you can see the background layer has very, very warm colors. It would be it kind of implies that there's a lot of warm sunlight, maybe kind of more of a summer or fall atmosphere to what's going on there. So in the colors menu, we can do color temperature to shift the person towards being in a colder climate or being in a hotter direct sunlight kind of climate. So if you know the original temperature, you can set that. Otherwise, you can just kind of lower it towards the color. Otherwise, you can just lower the intended temperature down to imply coldness. You can see this shifts everything a lot more towards blue. Or in this case, what we probably actually want, we can shift it towards a higher temperature, kind of giving us that warm, fuzzy, orange, red feeling. So if we bump it up there a bit, hit OK. And with those couple color effects, it's a little bit more believable that the person is in the scene. Obviously, there's still a lot of problems, like the scale, the position. So we can use the move tool up here, put her on the road. Maybe we want to scale things down. So keeping around center. Okay, I guess the scale is going to take a little bit to apply here because the original image and the layer mask need to be scaled as well. And we can position her on the road. So obviously there'd be a lot more work to do here. For instance, she doesn't really have a shadow anymore. So there are other issues to correct, but hopefully that gets you pointed at least in the right direction. Okay, so inside of GIMP, there are also some automated tools. So obviously this is a really beautiful image, and I got it off Pixabay, great source for stock photos and that kind of thing. So this is some pretty nice artwork already, but if we say wanted to make the colors a little bit more brighter here in this well-lit area, we could go up to the colors menu, go down to auto and color enhance. So this is just an automated tool that's going to try to brighten up the colors a little bit. So you can see here, it made it even warmer in these well-lit areas. I can hit Control Z and you see the saturation goes down a little bit. So if I go back and forth here, hopefully you can kind of see how it brightens up everything and makes the lighting a little bit more obvious. So you may not always like the results of the automated tools, but there's a few in there in these later versions of GIMP, so worth checking out if you have the time. Okay, so I think we're at the last topic now, which is filters. So filters are basically effects that you can apply over a layer for your graphic. Let's try to show off a few. Okay, so vignette is where you basically have a shape, typically like an iris, or a circle or oval shape that goes around the middle, and that would be where you'd want to focus your eyes on. And then in these outer areas, it darkens them by blackening them out as it gets to the edges. So the vignette effect you can find under filters, and then light and shadow, and then vignette. And you can see exactly what I was talking about here. The center stays vivid, but the outer areas are basically darkened. And you can click on these control gizmos to affect which areas are going to apply with that. So we can adjust the shape of the vignette. And that can be a pretty cool tool when you want to have the person viewing your image kind of focus their eye on something. So that's vignette. And obviously there's a bunch of settings you can play around with here. I'm not going to get to each one. Another option is drop shadow. So I did actually forget text. So let's do text. So text tool here in the toolbox. You click there and you have the ability to set fonts. So click the font, drop down, and you can pick any font installed on your computer. Let's go ahead and I'll just use Baby Snowy. It's a really good font, which you can pick up on defont.com if you want for free. I'm gonna left click here, and that gives us the ability to start writing our text box here. So like wherever this box is appearing, that's where your text is going to go. And I can start typing stuff in here. So learn GIMP. I don't know. Kind of random text there. And you'll see the bounds of the box automatically expand to match your text. It doesn't necessarily have to stay there though. We can adjust the bounds, which is also going to adjust the position of the text depending on where it's anchored. And we can just stretch this text box over our image. So controlling each of the corners with these outer tools. So bottom is going to go down and up, and the corners will go two directions at once, of course. If you want to align the text to one side of the box, then you can use left justify over here in the toolbox. So that pushes it to the left side of our text area. Right justify puts it to the right. And there's also filled. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it looks like it tries to fill out all the space in a sense. Usually I'll just use that centered, and what I would actually do is use the move tool on the text layer. Note that whenever you use text, it creates it on its own layer by default. And then we can drag this around the screen. So you can just position it wherever you need. If you really need to position your text, ideally, then what you can use is a guide. So if you go up to image and then guides, do new guide by %. I'll do a vertical guide, so going top to bottom, direction vertical, hit OK. And now we can position that text perfectly in the center. So guide's super helpful. Likewise, you can use a horizontal guide when you want it to be perfectly centered vertically. Okay, yeah, but what I wanted to show was drop shadow. So I add drop shadow to text all the time. Probably going to have it on the thumbnail for this video. If you want to find the drop shadow filter, go up to Filters, Light and Shadow, Drop Shadow, and I have a preset here. So with effects, you can actually hit the plus button and create a preset so that you don't need to redo the settings every single time. But if we zoom in here, you can kind of see the drop shadow already there. What I'll do is I'll hide the underlying layer so we can actually see the drop shadow itself. You'll see it's not very visible and it's highly blurred. So what I like to do is turn down the blur radius, and then it becomes a lot more of an obvious silhouette. And then I take the X and Y and make it much closer to the original. I also boost the opacity up so that it is much more visible. So my typical drop shadow is something like this: a blur of 2 pixels, an opacity of 2, and then a relatively tight to the original text X and Y coordinates. And then you can hit OK. Or in my case, just create a preset, and then every time I want to use it, I'll just go to the drop down and choose it there. So that's my typical settings there: 2, 1, and 10. And then I hit OK. And when you do that, though, when you apply an effect to a text element, note that it's no longer a text box. It's actually just a layer. So you can edit it like you can any other layer. I could even take a paintbrush and draw on it. So like that. Obviously, you can't do that with normal text. So if you want to change the text, what you'll have to do on that text layer is to use the text tool, click on it, and you'll get this text box that'll pop up, and it'll basically say that, hey, you're trying to do text editing. If you do this, it's going to remove all the modifications. So if I edit there now, it goes back to having no drop shadow, no brush stroke through the center of it. So just note that if you want to edit your text, try to have it totally done before you try to edit it in ways like drop shadow or like brush strokes. But generally, you could just do that on another layer anyway. So if you really want to draw brush strokes, just create a new layer and do that on top of it. Then you can still actually edit the text and not have to worry about losing all your changes, which is the idea of layers. Don't lose your changes and don't make mistakes that are permanent. All right, so we can go up to filters, and you'll see repeat here at the top. So whatever your last used effect is always going to be there. So quick access to just add the drop shadow back in. Let's see, Waterpixels. Okay, so this is a fun effect if it's still working like how I remember it. I think it used to be called watercolor, not waterpixels. But if we go to filters and do artistic, and then we go down to, where is it? Waterpixels. Let's change the superpixel size. Yeah, okay. So like doing a watercolor or a paint by numbers, it kind of pixelates the image in kind of a watercolor or acrylic painting style. Anyway, it's just a really cool effect. You can take something, remove a lot of the detail from it, and give it these kind of artistic looks. Whole idea of the artistic category. And that can just be a really interesting look there. So that is pretty cool. Lots of other filters here. And the last thing I want to point out in this video, though, is that if you want even more filters, then what you should do is go online, find this plugin called GIMP. It's free. So that's G''MIC. And you can open this up once you've installed it. Make sure you get the GIMP version, obviously. This plugin also works with tools like Krita, which is a free painting program. GIMP is more about photo editing. And when you open this up, you can apply these filters to your image layers. So you can see here just under artistic, there is so many more options you can choose from to apply to your graphics. So if you like filters, GIMP is going to be really handy for you. So some pretty awesome stuff in there. And then it's similar. You just, change your settings. You can apply, hit OK, so on and so forth. And let's actually see how that turns out. Pretty crazy. There's some pretty fun effects. I don't want this video to go on forever, so hopefully you guys learned a lot about GIMP inside of this tutorial, specifically for beginners. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.